My guest today is General Mota Gur, who was Israel's chief of staff from 1974 through 1978. He's presently a member of the Knesset. General Gur, I'd like to ask you to explain briefly the general concept of the Israeli army with respect to the standing army and the reserves in the context of Israel always needing a certain amount of lead time in an emergency to call up the reserves.
Well, basically, the standing army should give an answer to all the immediate threats that might open from one day to another. While with the reserve forces, we should be able to defend ourselves against any threat by any of the Arab countries or all of them together. The combination of the ground forces, naval forces, and the air forces should give the answers in the standing forces, armed forces, and usually we have to play very carefully with that combination so that nobody will be able to surprise us in any moment, in any place.
In reading Golda Meir's book, she made a large point of the fact that she regretted very much that prior to the 73 Yom Kippur conflict, that she had not called up the reserves earlier. Could you give us some background on that and some of the considerations that obviously had to be in her mind in making that decision, either positive or negative?
Let's put it that way. After the Yom Kippur War, we have learned some of the lessons. And I can tell you that the main lesson that we decided was true is the fact that for a country like Israel, it's very dangerous to wait to have a certain early warning, either by a word or by any other signal. We should always try to find a combination of facts among the enemy forces that in our mind and in our assessment might combine to a real threat. And then we have to do something. Sometimes it's calling reserves. Sometimes it's mobilizing all the reserves. What Golda Meir was talking about was the fact that in spite of many, many signs that we have had, both on the Egyptians and the Syrians' sides, we maybe did not take enough precautions and we did not put enough emphasis on the alert and the readiness of the standing army. To mobilize the reserve forces, that could have been quite a complicated issue.
What is the ratio generally between the standing army and the reserve forces?
Well, that depends on the time, but usually it will be 1 to 5.
5 reserve?
5, yeah, when we mobilize all of them. Now, in Israel, to mobilize reserves, it might mean sometimes to immobilize civilian life, industry, economy, and so on. And that's why it's quite difficult for the government to take a measure like that. And when Golda Meir was talking about it, she referred mainly to the fact that it was complicated to mobilize enough forces several days ahead of time because the assessment was not such. And finally, when it came to a critical moment, it was too late because mobilization of the reserve forces takes some time. So that was the problem. And no doubt it might happen again and again in the future, and Israeli governments will have to make up their mind about it. In that respect, the early warning and the system of intelligence assessment are extremely important. And that's why, by the way, why we insist so much of having the most modern and sophisticated systems of intelligence.
Now, you were not the chief of staff in 1973, but Golda Meir mentions that her then chief of staff, David Eliezer, when it was obvious that Egypt and Syria were preparing to attack Israel, and obviously this was only a day or two before they actually did attack, or a few days at most, he recommended a preemptive strike, which she decided against. Now, in purely military terms, forgetting for the moment about political considerations, which I'll ask you about, Would a preemptive strike have been the move to make at that point?
First of all, we are not talking about several days before or even one day before. That recommendation took place the same morning of the Yom Kippur. And as a matter of fact, with all the considerations of the Air Force, that preemptive strike could have taken place only maybe 2 hours or 4 hours before the timetable of the Egyptian-Syrian attack.
Well, that fact is widely misunderstood. If you're saying that really not until the very day of the attack did Israel know it was going to be attacked. So their warning was hours rather than even an entire day.
We have to distinguish between two things. The matter of intelligence assessment, whether the Egyptians and the Syrians were going to attack, that was an issue that took few days. But our assessment was at the time that the attack was not going to take place. When it was finally recognized that it might take place, that was only the last night before Yom Kippur, and that critical meeting between the Chief of Staff and the Minister of Defense and the Prime Minister took place only a few hours before the war started. And then General Al-Azhar recommended the preemptive strike. But we have to remember that it was so late that the Air Force could do it only in one front, and that was the Syrian front. So even when we are talking about a preemptive strike so late, it could have only a very limited effect. Now, to a certain extent, people could believe that such a preemptive strike could prove to the Arabs, to the Egyptians and the Syrians, that we, the Israelis, we know about their plan, and that might have, well, nobody can be sure about that, might have stopped them. I have to say that personally, I doubt whether in such a late phase it could really be very, very effective. Again, the lesson is that we must be much more careful in the future.
Well, of course, in '67, Israel did decide in favor of a preemptive strike, and you seem to be saying that in '73 the situation was much different and it was basically too late.
Again, with your permission, I have to distinguish again between the words and their meanings and their names. In '67, we had first information about the Egyptians crossing the Nile in May 15. And the government and the general staff immediately took places. And we started mobilizing small forces, relatively small forces, beginning in the 16th and 17th.
Of May.
And so, yes. And so daily we mobilized more and more. And then a day came in which it was clear that the deployment of the Egyptian forces in Sinai was such that even without an attack, it was so dangerous to Israel that something should have done. On the other side, so much of the Israeli reserve forces were mobilized that we practically didn't have any choice, because we had to decide whether we are moving forward or we send the people back home. Now, the combination of these two problems made the final decision that we had to take a preemptive war, because that was not a strike. A strike is a limited strike, and that was in '67 a preemptive war. Now, when I said before that in the future we must be much more careful, it gets back to '67, because then if you mobilize enough forces, a moment comes in which we have to decide whether we can undertake the danger of a new war initiated by the Arabs, or we have to start first. In order to prevent all that complication, it's better to have peace.
There's a body of opinion in the United States with respect to the hostages held in Iran for over a year that regards that as a disgraceful episode in American history, that the leading world power permitted some half-baked country ruled by someone regarded as essentially a lunatic in America to accomplish that. And of course, the people that held that opinion basically said, could you imagine Israel and what they did in Entebbe? Could you imagine the Soviet Union standing for that kind of a situation? And of course, you were Chief of Staff during the successful Entebbe operation. I want to ask you quite frankly, and you shouldn't really be reluctant to criticize America, if you are not really shocked and surprised, as an Israeli, with your military background, that America permitted that situation to exist where all the cards were in Khomeini's hands and we basically got the hostages back when they were ready to give us the hostages back.
Well, first of all, you know, I spent 2 wonderful years in Paris in the Col de Guerre. And there's one thing I know, one little thing, but sometimes it's quite important. The French say, toute proportion gardée. You have to keep proportions. And when we are talking about Israel and the United States, and when you compare 2 entirely different situations, we have better to bear in mind the huge difference between situations of that kind. Now, I don't know enough details about what took place in Iran and what was exactly the military, American military operation. I can only tell you that we had a lot of doubts before we decided to carry out the Entebbe operation. And I myself, as a chief of staff, could not present to the government a final, fundamental, acceptable military plan before the 5th day, which is quite a long time. And then, when I realized that we had enough information, I made it very clear to the government that there was a very good chance to be successful in the operation. I really don't know enough to make up my military mind whether such an operation could take place in Iran. I can only tell you, and I've written about it, that the American military plan, to me, sounded very logic and had quite a good chance.
You're talking now about the failed rescue mission.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. Analyzing the plan and analyzing the phases of the military operation, in my own view, it could succeed. Again, in my humble view, what I think lacked in the American operation was the channel of command. You see, we know our people, and I knew personally most of the people who took place in the operation. I knew quite well to what extent I could trust each of them in his very specific mission. When I heard them on the radio, I could know whether they were excited or not, whether I could trust them or not. When I didn't hear the chief of operations, General Adam, I knew that everything was going well because I knew him for so many years that I knew the way he was commanding operations. I believe that that kind of knowledge and interrelationship did not exist in the American chain of command. So that the people in Washington, for them it was quite difficult to make up their mind when some difficulties jumped up. And that's the crucial minute in which military people have to take decisions.
Yeah, but in terms of the psychological differences between Israel and the United States, it's obvious that Israel, at some point, that all of you decided, you as Chief of Staff, the Prime Minister, the Minister of Defense, sure, obviously you wouldn't try a plan unless you thought the plan was going to work. But there was no guarantee that the plan would in fact work, and had it not worked, you all knew that the 52 hostages, not the 52, however many hostages there were in the Entebbe raid, I think about 100, that they were dead. They were dead. And the point is that Israel was willing to take that risk, whereas America vacillated time and time again, because in terms of the way it's been analyzed in America, is that President Carter was simply not willing to take that risk, essentially for political reasons.
Unfortunately, I have to tell you that we have been much more experienced. And again, I say unfortunately, because I myself, as the Chief of Staff, I did have to take decisions of that kind at least 10 times. And the same with the Minister of Defense and the Prime Minister. And we have the procedure of the decision-making very fast. In that respect, our policy, the government policy, was quite clear. And it meant that whenever hostages, Israeli hostages, are being taken, we attack in order to release them, even if we had to sacrifice people, both among the military and the civilians. So when we learned more about Entebbe, it was basically obvious that we should take a military operation if there is any chance, and the calculated risk will be really calculated. In that respect, there is a huge difference between Israel and many other countries. Because,
Unfortunately.
yes, as I said,
unfortunately, because
we
the
are on the
opposite
run.
attitude encourages the terrorists.
That's true. And that's why we all felt that if there was only the slightest chance of military operation, we should undertake it. I hesitated a lot as long as we did not have enough intelligence. But once I knew where the hostages were kept and to what extent the air base was guarded, then I could make up my mind. And once we made up our mind, it went quite easily.
I know that many Israelis are amazed at the naivete of American leaders, for example, with the situation of the Shah of Iran. Certainly, in some respects, from the American perspective, he was a dictator and there were political prisoners and all the civil liberties were not as nice as Americans would have liked it. But what we seem not to do in our country is to consider the realistic alternatives. Now, with the Khomeini regime, Americans are analyzing the situation and saying that the Shah, in effect, was a great man, that he could have maintained any degree of stability in a nation such as that, where people are being indiscriminately slaughtered.
Let me tell you, if only a little bit more people would have that capability to try and foresee things before they happen, many, many mistakes could have been stopped. And unfortunately, most people analyze and judge whatever they see and they realize. It's much more difficult to try and foresee and predict things and judge on a higher level, a more sophisticated way. And I can tell you that even in our policy, very, very often we hit that kind of problem, and not always we give the right answer. I've been in Iran a few months before the revolution took place. And I can tell you that talking to a lot of the generals and high officials, I believe they did not realize enough the amount of agitation that persisted in the country among the people. And in my view, if they could only give up a little bit of what they had, they could have prevented. But that's much easier to say after it happened.
Well, certainly, though, the American leadership did not have to be brilliant to understand that whoever replaced the Shah was not going to be some great civil libertarian, and that once the Shah left, everything was going to be hunky-dory, because that was not the makeup of Iran.
Well, if you ask me on the national level, I think that that was a much bigger mistake than the military operation, the military raid.
It's
גמרתם מספיק? גמרתם? Stanley, just תסתכל אחד לשני.
It's supposed to look and nod.
למה סרטון? אחר כך. Stanley, זה אחד שתיים שלוש. Stanley, זה אחד שתיים שלוש.
1, 2, 3.
Wise guy. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Reaction. Now go, just look at Akshir here. Oh, very nice. That smells kind of. איך אתה מתחיל?
A new question.
He had a new question we've decided on.
אוקיי, אנחנו מתחילים ממש מהר. אוקיי, אתה מתחיל? 5, 4, hello, 2,
Go ahead.
General Gur, why is it that so many Israeli generals seem to go into politics after they retire from the military?
Well, the fact is not so many are going into
It
politics.
seems that way. Moshe
But
Dayan.
some of the most known are going
That's
into
right.
politics.
Certainly
That's
some of the
better,
most
yeah,
known.
yeah.
Okay. Well, of course, they become better known as they go into politics. at least
Sometimes it's the opposite.
maybe less liked,
Yeah.
but better known.
No, but really, I believe that the main reason is the fact that from a certain point in the military career, the military people are so much involved on the national level decision-making that you get used to work with a lot of politicians. You get used to be involved in the high-level decision-making. You're being involved with a lot of the civilians along the borders. You know their problem. You know their attitude. You become known and you become involved. And you cannot just cut yourself out once you're out of the army. I believe that that's the main reason. At least the people that I know from very close, that was the most, the strongest motivation.
The Middle East is difficult, perhaps, to understand for people here in the Middle East, but particularly difficult to understand for Americans because there seem to be so many fictions going on. For example, prior to 1967, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, the Sinai, was all in Arab hands. Why then did not the Arab brothers give the PLO and the so-called Palestinians a state? And why is that? I think that is perhaps a defect in the public relations, or however you want to characterize it, of Israel, that things like that are not sufficiently explained.
The fact is true. And I'm afraid that it's not as a result of a very bad Israeli explanation. You see, in modern world, things are moving forward so fast that the memory becomes very short. And what really interests people is not so much what was in the past, but whether there is a solution right now in the present and toward the future. When we have been in Egypt for the peace negotiations, and I tried to explain to General Gamassi and his generals the way we look on our security, based on our experience in the past, he interrupted me very often and said, "Believe me, General Gur, it's no use to talk about the past. Let's talk about the future." And I said, "Okay, but in order to secure the future, we better know what happened in the past." So I said it, but I could feel and I could realize that General Gamassi, like many others, and I've been in the States many times, and I've heard the same answer: forget the past. It's no use to repeat it. You better look forward to the future.
Except he that forgets the past often repeats the past.
Unfortunately, if something like what happened in the past will repeat itself in the future, what will they say? Oh,
let's start from scratch.
That's a problem. And we are not in a position to accept such an attitude. So we have to find a combination of the right lessons of the past in order to prepare ourselves the right way for the future. It's also true to that question of the Palestinian state. There is no doubt that for many, many, many years the Palestinians did not consider themselves as a separate people of the all Arab nation, what they call. Now at a certain moment, one day, they decided to become such a people, and they decided that It was no good to stay and to remain without their own state. And that day they decided to become a people that want a state. Now that becomes a political reality, and we have to take that into consideration. So it's not enough to explain what was in the past, but to realize what takes place now and whether there is a solution to that. So now I think there are very few people in the world and also in Israel that believe that there is a general or comprehensive solution to the Middle East problem, unless there is also a solution to the Palestinian problem, which was not the reality about 15 years ago.
Well, all right, another huge fiction. The fact of the matter is, Egypt and Israel have signed a separate peace. Now, concomitant with that fact is the fiction that Sadat and Israel are going to negotiate on the critical issue of Palestinian autonomy when the Palestinians have repeatedly repudiated Sadat and Israel as having no standing to represent them. So even assuming, which has not happened to date, Egypt and Israel could come to some kind of agreement on Palestinian autonomy, in reality, wouldn't it be relatively meaningless?
Well, that's quite difficult to give a very definite and clear answer to that, because here we go into the field of assessments and beliefs. As a matter of fact, you were right to emphasize and the political feeling at the time that if a solution, a peace solution, will be found between Egypt and Israel, it will affect immediately the relationship between Israel and the other Arab countries, including the Palestinians. For quite a long time, a lot of people, even in Israel, did not really realize the depth of the Palestinian problem. And they thought that it could be solved as a result of some other solution. But I believe that that also has gone. To what extent the Camp David Agreement might affect an Israeli-Palestinian agreement? That's a question to be solved. I've met a lot of Palestinian leaders in the last 2 years. For most of them, the autonomy or the Camp David Agreement seems like a curse. That's how they call it, a curse. They don't accept it from the beginning to end. But at the same time, they don't have any other solution. Some of them agree to consider a certain compromise, temporarily. Some of them believe that, Allah, God, will find a solution in time. They're quite skeptic about the basic possibility of such a solution because they realize the depth of the antagonism that has been created and the difficulty of finding a solution. Now, I personally, in my mind, if once both people, the Palestinian Arabs and the Israelis, will accept the fact of the need of the coexistence, political solution or political arrangement can be found. Unfortunately, in the last few years, a big part of the world referred to us as if we should recognize their rights. The fact is exactly opposite. We never rejected their right of any Arab to have their own life and political life, while the Palestinians, and especially the PLO, reject the mere fact of our political and physical existence. In my view, if they change that attitude, many solutions can be found with the Egyptians or without the Egyptians.
Well, in this world of form over substance, there are many people that say that if the PLO simply said, without really meaning it, but simply said as a tactical device to get America to put tremendous pressure on the State of Israel by simply saying the magic words, we recognize Israel's right to exist and we accept Resolution 242 of the United Nations. Isn't that in actuality a danger for Israel if they were to mouth those words but not really change their policies and blame future terrorist acts on offshoots, or it wasn't condoned, that
Well,
type
you see,
of
the
thing.
same way you can reject the Egyptian peace, because the same way you can say that Sadat or his people were ready to pronounce the recognition of Israel in order to get back Sinai, and after the evacuation of Sinai by the Israelis, the peace will not have any sense. Now, of course, in such a process, each side takes risks, and unfortunately, we Israelis have to take the bigger risks. On the other hand, let me tell you that it
Because
took
because if Egypt did that, you'd have to recapture the Sinai again,
That's true.
which happened in '56. You captured the
67.
Sinai, right?
Oh, let me tell you, I've been in mid-Sinai in the War of Independence, in a very deep raid
In '48.
in 48. So I've been there several times. And that's a danger, that's a risk that we undertake. On the other hand, you have to realize that for Sadat and for the Egyptians, it also took many, many years before they could express the recognition of Israel. And you shouldn't underestimate that change, the same way as you shouldn't overestimate it. For the PLO, for many Palestinians, to express the recognition of Israel as a political state, to negotiate with it, because it's not enough to express a recognition. Then you have to sit down and negotiate on the basis of the Israeli existence. If they have to take, and if they will dare to take that step, no doubt Israel will have to undertake some new risks in order to find a peaceful solution.
Well, is it your position as a member of the Knesset that if Arafat got up tomorrow and mouthed those words, we accept Israel's right to exist, we accept Resolution 242, we still want a Palestinian state, but we will talk to the Israelis, you would then talk to them?
No doubt, and as fast as possible. I was born in Jerusalem, and I've been living many, many years with the Arabs, and my father was working in an Arab company. And I don't have any illusions about a very peaceful life, permanent peaceful life. Even in the family there are quarrels from time to time. But basically we have to realize the fact of coexistence. And once the PLO will change their platform, and once they will decide that they are talking with us, they recognize Israel and our right to exist as a state, that means that it's not the PLO anymore. And in our platform of my party, we made it very, very clear that we will talk to any Palestinian that will reject the Palestinian platform, charter, and the use of terrorism.
Your party being Labor.
Yeah, the Labour Party. And I knew exactly what at least I meant when we defined it, and I was very, very active in that definition. And no doubt if they will take that step, it will be a very, very important move forward to a mutual coexistence.
But you're not holding your breath that they're going to take the step very quickly.
Let me tell you, I was considered a dove for many, many years because I believed as a child who grew up in Jerusalem in the coexistence when so many other people call themselves hawks. I was considered a dove. But I always believed in the need of coexistence. At the same time, when Sadat came to Jerusalem, I knew that what he was going to ask us was much more than we could afford. And I was against his visit the way it took place. That's why I insist now that we realize that if the PLO and the other Palestinians will be ready to recognize us and our right to live, we should talk to them. Because then our attitude will be realistic. We know what we can expect. They will know what they can expect. And then when we come to the table of negotiations, we Israelis will not have to give beyond what I consider as a must and beyond such a border that will put in jeopardize our security. So in that respect, you have to take the calculated risk.
From the perception of American Gentiles, which after all are 97% of the population in America, they say, many of them say, well, obviously we understand the American Jewish emotional commitment to the State of Israel. But I'd like to give you the opportunity to explain to them, from a purely selfish American standpoint, why it is in America's interest to be a very strong ally and supporter of the State of Israel in this region, as opposed to just making peace and getting along with all the Arab states and having all the cheap oil we want.
Yeah, you see, any chain is being judged by its weak points. And in political relationship, you judge peoples and countries on the basis of the most important and crucial moments in their coexistence. Now, if you take the foreign policy of the United States in the last 10 years, you see that whenever there was a real crisis in the Middle East, in the Russian-American conflict, which is the most important strategically for the United States, the only power in the Middle East on which the United States could rely was Israel. In 1970, when there were problems in Jordan, President Nixon could refer only to Israel. When the United States had problems in Cambodia, and the Russians almost took over the battle there, then we, or along the Suez Canal, we hit the Russians. Only the Israelis shot down 5 Russian pilots and planes, which immediately changed the whole turn of the tide in favor of the American policy. Immediately after the Yom Kippur War, I've been the military attaché in Washington, and I could realize to what extent the United States could keep its predominance in the Middle East by the game, by the play, a sophisticated one, with Egypt, Syria, and Israel, a game in which Israel was the major pilot, because we could give back territories and we could hold them back. And America could keep itself much higher, and the Russians were out. So whenever it comes to a real problem, to a crucial minute, Israel, until now, was the only one to stay trustful, confident, able, and basically friendly to the American policy.
Do you see any Arab leader on the horizon who is going to follow Sadat's lead and make peace with Israel and start talking realistically to his own people that Israel is not going anywhere? It's a fact of life.
Let me tell you, my worry, based on the events that took place in Egypt in the last few days, is to what extent a future leader in Egypt will be able to follow Sadat. Not talking about other Arab...
And keep the agreement.
And keep the agreement. Not talking about other Arab leaders. But what I am sure, that at least we Israelis, we have to carry out such a policy that will ensure that if any Arab leader will find the opportunity and will be strong enough and wise enough in order to grab it, that we will be ready for that without endangering our security.
General Gur, thank you very much.
Thank you, too.